We're going to start with 3 short videos to set the scene. First, Jeffrey Sachs, probably the top UN academic as head of Columbia University's Earth Institute and advisor to the UN Secretary General. Following him will be Bill Nye, a leading US climate scientist and public commentator. And last but not least, Greta Thunberg, making a valid point as only she can.
I'm Jeffrey Sachs. I'm a university professor at Columbia University and a senior advisor at the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals. I am deeply troubled and concerned. We're living in a period of incredible disasters, hurricanes, floods, droughts hitting the world. My God, what are we doing? This is really dangerous. People need to understand this. There's going to be worse to come in the future, even if we get everything under control, because we have a process that is gradually going to warm the planet for some decades now. And as that warming comes, that's more energy that's going to fuel intense storms, cause more extreme heat waves, more floods, and more droughts. Unless we are very clear and agree globally that by the middle of this century, we have replaced fossil fuel with wind, solar, hydro, ocean, and other zero carbon forms of energy. I know how hard it is to get the world to change course. There are so many powerful interests. Our politics are short-term, often very corrupt. But what we've learned from big social change, whether it was the fight to end slavery, whether it's women's rights, whether it was the struggle to end colonization, it's a big task and all parts of society have to be engaged. Civil action, absolutely. The divestment campaign, consumer boycotts, litigation against bad behaviors, all crucial. Businesses, especially the ones that are clever, are going to say, the world's going in a different direction. I want to get ahead of the market so that I'm there. So business, very, very important. Government, vital. If we're going to have rule of law, we need government. We need activists in business, activists in government, activists in civil society to be taking the lead and helping all of society to understand this is real. Let's move.
We hear it so much that it feels like a buzzword, but it is far from it. Climate change is a real and serious issue. But isn't the climate always changing? What exactly is climate change, and why should we care? Well, the Earth's climate has changed throughout history. Most of these slight changes are caused by small variations in the Earth's orbit. But climate change as we know it today is characterized by an abrupt increase in the Earth's temperature. It is estimated to have gotten 1.2 to 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in just the last century. 10 out of the last 13 years were the warmest on record. 97% of climate scientists agree that this new tendency is not caused by the variations of the Earth's orbit, but rather very likely caused by human activities. That means you and me. And since the Industrial Revolution, we have come a long way. Humans built airplanes, faster cars, developed remarkable technology, and learned how the natural resources around us can be used for our benefit. Although this has led to many wonderful inventions and advancements, like the device you're using to watch this video, or the ability to take a plane halfway around the world, it also means we've increased our consumption of natural resources and in turn released a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, greenhouse gases occur naturally, but in excess can be dangerous to our planet. Modern human activities have increased the release of non-naturally occurring greenhouse gases because we have stepped up our demand for burning fossil fuels. The composition of greenhouse gases traps heat radiated from the sun. The more heat they trap, the warmer our planet gets. And as our planet gets warmer, we begin to feel the effects. One of climate change's biggest victims is our oceans. Oceans regulate the Earth's temperature and provide 50% of the Earth's oxygen. Now, climate change has increased the global temperature of the oceans by more than 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1969. Although a warmer ocean might seem inviting to a beachgoer, it actually has devastating consequences for supporting life at sea. One of those consequences is ocean acidification, a direct effect of increased dissolved CO2. Since the late 18th century, ocean surface acidification has increased by 30%. A higher acid content means calcifying species, like oysters and clams and shallow water corals, are at risk, putting the entire ocean food web at risk. This is bad news for the 1 billion people relying on the ocean as its primary source of protein. Climate change has also caused the sea level to rise. Just in the last century, sea levels have risen 6.7 inches, but the rate in the last decade has nearly doubled. Sea levels have risen because as the ocean gets warmer, it swells. On top of that, glaciers and ice sheets are melting. Antarctica lost 36 cubic miles of ice between 2002 and 2005, and since 1994, each year on average, the Earth has lost 400 billion tons from its glaciers. That's like an ice cube 7.5 kilometers on a side, 4 miles on a side, melting and flowing into the sea. When all that ice melts, it fills up our oceans, and just like filling up a bathtub, the shores can't hold all that water, and coastal regions get flooded. Troubling signs of climate change are increased extreme weather events. Natural disasters like floods, tornadoes, and deadly heat waves are more obvious to humans because of their immediate impact and their sharing of the images in the media. Climate change, as we know it today, is change in our Earth's overall temperature with massive and permanent ramifications. Spread your knowledge and concerns about climate change with others. When it comes to climate change, the main takeaway is that it's real. And although we are part of the cause, we can also be part of the solution.
This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero, blah, blah, blah. Climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises. Of course, we need constructive dialogue, but they've now had 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us? But, of course, we can still turn this around. It is entirely possible. It will take drastic annual emission cuts, unlike anything the world has ever seen. And as we don't have the technological solutions that alone can deliver anything close to that, that means we will have to change. We can no longer let the people in power decide what is politically possible or not. We can no longer let the people in power decide what hope is. Hope is not passive. Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action. And hope always comes from the people.
I'm sure you guys need no convincing as to the reality of the climate threat. But it's good to start on the same page. So let me underscore a few points. It's not some future 2050 issue only. It's here now. It's intensifying. Look at the floods in Europe. Look at the droughts in Africa. The heat in Western USA and in Canada. The forest fires in Australia. These are all consequences of an intensifying global warming. It's existential if we don't act decisively. Existential, not just insofar as concerns tourism, but insofar as concerns life in general. And we need to act decisively to deal with this. Tourism has no special protective characteristics and, frankly, no special circumstances in regard to other sectors of the economy. We have to play our part in adapting to the threats, and we have to simultaneously reduce our emissions in line with evolving societal norms. We don't have to be ahead of the curve, but we sure as hell shouldn't be behind the curve. And so far, we are behind. We're generally long on positioning and short on real system-wide action. For example, you take the Glasgow Declaration. If you look at the substance of it, it has less specifics than the UNWTO's Davos Declaration, which you'll find in your Thinkerific material. It has less specifics than the Davos Declaration that we created in 2007, 15 years ago. And it has a grand total of 650 signatories, many of whom are individuals from the hundreds and thousands of companies and communities out there. And it's just a declaration. We're still waiting to see how it will be matched by action. And as you'll see as we get into this course, this is the kind of accelerated approach that we're trying to put in place in SunX Malta through our climate-friendly travel registry. We'll deal with that in subsequent lectures. But now let's dig a little deeper into the substance with short video lectures from two of the real thought leaders in the tourism and climate space. And I hope you'll see they underscore the points that I've just been making. First is Professor Daniel Scott from the University of Waterloo in Canada. Daniel is a long-time contributor to the IPCC, and he was the lead author on UNWTO's groundbreaking 2007 study that first calculated tourism's carbon footprint at 5% of the global total and aviation at 40% of that 5%. And after Daniel, you're going to hear Professor Susan Beckham of Griffith University, Australia, advisor to Air New Zealand and to the Ministry of Environment in New Zealand.
Jeffrey's asked me to get us started with a little bit of a discussion on how the climate crisis is going to reshape tourism over the next 30 years or so. And in true Jeffrey style, he's given me about 7 minutes to do that. As all of these images show, climate change isn't some future risk for tourism, it's upon us. It's an increasingly important part of our lived experience, whether it be at home or at the destinations that we visit. And you are part of the next generation of travelers, but also tourism leaders that have a massively important role in creating that climate-friendly travel, that climate-friendly tourism economy that we all want to see. First, let me put the climate crisis into a bit of context of what we've been facing now and over the last couple of years. We all know that COVID has been devastating for the tourism sector. Positively, the rebound has begun and the world of travel is once again bringing us back together. And we have to resist that feeling that, everything that's been wrong for the last little while is going to stay that way. It won't. Defeatism is just as paralyzing to moving forward as is denial. And so the long transformative journey that's required of the climate crisis, it demands us to have a collective resolve to work together towards a vision of a better tourism system that we all know that exists and we want to work towards. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has released its 6th assessment reports that have come out this year, and the United Nations has declared that, climate change code red for humanity, a code red for tourism. And importantly, that this is the decisive decade for climate action as well. And you've all probably seen a figure like this that outlines the various choices that we have and the climate futures that will result from those choices. We have at the top end a red line that is a +3 or warmer world, something we can all agree that we don't want to see happen, but that's the path we're on with emissions today. We have the light blue line in the middle. That's where, if all the pledges from countries to the Paris Climate Agreement were fulfilled, that would take us into that realm. And then we have at the bottom end, the dark blue line. That is that +2 or even a +1.5 world that the Paris Climate Agreement is working towards, that we all want, and we all want to work together. So the question is, what do these different potential futures mean? And importantly, they're all going to transform tourism, but in different ways. And primarily through two challenges that I wanted to bring to you today. So the first challenge that we'll face is carbon risk, sorry. How are we going to decarbonize tourism over the next 30 years so that it can have a place in that net zero economy that we all want to see in the 2050s? And the second challenge is climate risk. How do we adapt to the impacts of a changing climate that we're committed to from past emissions? And how at the same time can we foster a more sustainable and more just tourism system at the same time? So let's take a look at those two challenges, and we'll start with the world that we want to see and what are the implications of that net zero transition for tourism. And what this figure shows is, first of all, tourism carbon emissions today, which are roughly 5-8% of the global total. It also shows you the trajectory of where our emissions, where we estimate they will be, and how those compare to that net zero pledge that was made by the tourism sector through the Glasgow Declaration. So we have this major gap that we have to address over the next 30 years. And so our question is, how and what are the best ways that we're going to do that? Importantly, there are some real scalable solutions that can make this transformation happen. The International Energy Agency gives us one credible roadmap of key strategies that include improving efficiency in hotels, aircraft, the electrification of tour buses and other parts of the tourism system for a clean grid, demand management in some cases, and an important one, sustainable aviation fuels, whether it be through biomass or new synthetic fuels, and modal shifts in some cases, shifting more tourism to electrified buses, to electrified aircraft, and high-speed rail. And we need, real policy, real investment to make this collection of excellent examples that we have here, rather than making them the exceptions. We want these to be the norm. We want these to be mainstreamed over the next decade or so. And we have to do this, not just to decarbonize our operations, but to demonstrate that world leaders, the policymakers on the climate file, that tourism can be part of that net zero economy by mid-century. It won't be easy, it won't be cheap, but we have to look at this as an investment in our social license to be part of that future economy, a carbon constrained economy, and not just, from a cost perspective. Now let's consider the world that we don't want, and that is we might call it a climate disrupted economy. We know that's incompatible with the Sustainable Development Goals. It's incompatible with the kind of sustainable tourism that we want to see, and we don't have time today to go through the wide range of different types of impacts that tourism is seeing, and we'll see increasingly, from weather extremes to sea level rise, and even economic or security risks. So instead, let's look at how all of those different kinds of impacts will come together in different parts of the world, and what that will mean for tourism around the world. So we can look at a map like this, which is the geography of the combined climate and carbon risk as best as we can estimate it today. It's not perfect, but one of the things that jumps out in front of you when you see this map is how uneven or unfair the impacts that are expected to be in some parts of the world. The highest risk, or from climate and carbon risk, exists in regions of the world where tourism growth is expected to be the strongest. So climate change will pose a sort of headwind for tourism development in parts of Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America. And even more importantly, when we look at how these impacts, if we look at them through a climate justice lens, we see that, again, some of the biggest impacts are likely to be in the places of the world that rely most on tourism for their economy. And we can't lose sight of this as we develop strategies to adapt and reduce emissions in tourism. We have to keep that climate justice lens in front of us. So with that, bit of context to get us started in our discussion, I want to leave you with two key messages. First, there can be no sustainable tourism or success on the Sustainable Development Goals if we fail on climate. And the second one is, a very wise man reminded us, don't accept that you can't make a difference. What we do as individuals matters. It adds up, especially, and we see that over the last several years, last 3 to 5 years, youth of the world have really found their voice on the climate file. And I encourage you to join those millions that are on the streets and continue to push, what is politically possible, push it closer and closer to what is, we know, scientifically necessary to address the climate crisis.
Hi, my name is Susanna Becken. I'm a professor of sustainable tourism both at Griffith University and the University of Surrey, and I will provide a short summary of what's been happening on climate change and tourism in the last year. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released 2 reports as part of their 6th assessment. One was in August 21, Working Group 1, and the other one was just now in February 22 on the impacts and adaptation. And it just confirms what, of course, we knew, that the path is closing in terms of avoiding climate catastrophe. Only immediate, deep and sustained emission reductions will really avoid substantial warming. If we go with the pledges of countries, we're still heading more for a 3-degree warming and not the 2-degree or even 1.5 that we want to achieve. Now, what's important to know is that even if we fail to deliver on 1.5, every fraction of a degree that we can avoid will save lives, save livelihoods, save species and ecosystems. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now 412 parts per million. That's how you measure. And I remember when it crossed the 400 in 2013, that was a big deal because we never quite thought it would go that much. And in 1900, only sort of 120 years ago, it was 296. So it's going up and it's accelerating despite all the science and the political discussions that we've had for the last 20 or 30 years. So this is the decade of action. In tourism, there's also been a bit of progress. The Glasgow Declaration was launched. Basically, organizations that subscribe to the pledge commit to deliver reduction plans for carbon and in the order of reducing emissions by half in the next decade and reaching net zero by 2050. The World Travel and Tourism Council also released a net zero roadmap, and there's a whole bunch of other activities and pledges and roadmaps and tools. So there's been a lot of progress, at least in terms of ambition and awareness. But what matters now is what comes next. And so I will summarize the key issues. One is pressure on actual measurement and monitoring of emissions and reductions. So pledges are nice, intentions are good, but we need to reduce absolute reductions, ideally around the science-based targets. Carbon offsetting has lost quite a bit of credibility and currency. It's maybe still nice in terms of a donation to promote basically decarbonization projects, but what really counts is real reductions in their own organization. The second thing that really stands out is aviation. So the last 12 months have seen significant activity by many players in the airline industry, sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen, electric planes, and investments are starting to be made. Qantas announced a $50 million investment into sustainable aviation fuel. And so there's lots of pilots, lots of small scale stuff, still insufficient to make immediate big gains, but at least the ball has started rolling more so than ever. The third thing I would say is the role of government and the public sector and policy making really enabling change. For example, in aviation, in those countries where the industry and government actually work together, like, for example, Norway and the Netherlands. That's where the biggest progress is happening. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought the public sector more to the center again for stimulation packages, bailouts, support policy. And this is where the whole notion of building back better has gained traction. Unfortunately, at this point, only 21% of government bailout or support measures are classed as green by the OECD, so in some ways a missed opportunity of the other 79%. The fourth point that's really important is regenerative tourism, regeneration of ecosystems, nature-based tourism, and really reinvesting in natural capital. And that has also been identified by the IPCC in the most recent report as one of the most important adaptation measures to climate change, is restore the health of the ecosystems. And tourism can play a major role in that. And that leads almost to the final point is around community empowerment, place-based tourism, working with the local stakeholders on sustainable destination management plans that also address issues of social license over tourism, and maybe slower localized tourism that really reduces carbon from supply chains, from improving the circularity of the local economy and so on. So I want to conclude by saying, what can young leaders do? What can you contribute? And I think there's a lot of opportunity. One is young people have new ideas, be creative and innovative, so come up with new business ideas that are really built around this whole transition, social enterprises, innovative solutions, either through technology or for particular people-to-people experience economy opportunities. So there's space to upskill. We all need to build carbon literacy and really deep sustainability understanding, and we need to encourage others and bring others along. Really important is critical thinking. Don't believe everything. Take biofuels as an example. There's a lot of challenges. There's no easy solutions. Sometimes we think we've got a silver bullet, but there's unintended consequences. So we need to be very careful and question everything so we don't dig the hole deeper. Next one is encourage government. Go out there or protest or become politically engaged. Support the politicians to make the decisions that they need to make. They're very risk adverse. And finally, as for all of us, start with our own behavior. Be the change you want to see. We all can make a difference. The more people make a difference, the more it becomes a norm, and it has a domino effect to really achieve what we need to do.
Finally today, you have my lecture on the overview of 50 years of global environment and climate action. This lecture is designed to familiarize you with the 50-year evolution of today's global climate action. And you can see these on the slide here, which I will be returning to during the course of my lecture this morning. It will cover the events and not the critical role played by my longtime friend and mentor, the late Maurice Strong, who was responsible for so much of this 50-year program, for putting in place the institutional framework and for driving the thinking behind today's modern environmentalism. We'll cover Maurice in detail in a lecture in a few weeks' time. He is the inspiration for Sun X Malta. But the starting point is in the early 1970s, the birth of modern environmental thinking. It's when the UN convened its first Earth Summit in Stockholm in 1972. This massive global event was convened against the background of the Club of Rome's historic Limits of Growth report. That report defined planetary boundaries and the human action taken to breach them. This was also a time of growing environment-related challenges on the ground. I myself remember the pea soup fogs in Europe. As a student, we would have to walk from our hall of residence to our lectures, holding on to the person in front because you could not see further than the distance of the length of your arm. And that was in the UK in the 1960s. There were harsh droughts in Africa, grossly polluted rivers in the United States. It was a time of limited global tourism, with jet aircraft only recently introduced. And there were few, if any, environment or climate ministries. The first ministry was actually created in 1970 in the United Kingdom. Today, every country has a Ministry of Environment, and many even a Ministry of Climate. The 1972 Stockholm Summit had only one head of state in attendance, Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister of India and leader of the Group of 77, a powerful geopolitical coalition of the world's so-called developing countries. 120 countries attended the Stockholm event. It led, amongst other things, to the transformation of the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, to a permanent body, and the first based in the developing world in Nairobi in Kenya. It marked the start of most countries getting deeply into environmental issues. It produced a declaration with 26 key principles on the future of our planet, as well as some 250 areas for further action. And I repeat, it is the start of modern-day environmentalism. On the timeline, the next major event of a similar nature is the Rio Earth Summit 20 years later. And by the way, that's not a coincidence. You will see that there is a systematic approach to holding the big Earth summits, first 20, then 10, and now if you look at the COPs and the UNFCCC COPs, because that's not the only COP in existence. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. So wherever you have a convention, like the Biodiversity Convention, you have a COP. But the climate has become such an important issue on our agenda that the climate COPs are seen almost in the same category as global environmental high-level meetings. And not surprisingly, because they're now attended by so many heads of state. Before the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, there had been a flurry of preparatory action. The UN system had created the Brundtland Commission in 1987, and that defined sustainable development under the leadership of Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway. It basically said we should only use the Earth resources so as not to deplete them for future generations. Also, importantly, in 1988, the IPCC was established, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was a science-based body created by Maurice Strong in the UN Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization, UNEP and WMO, the one dealing with environment, the other dealing with weather-related issues, to deliver periodic stock takings of the state of climate metrics, climate calculations, climate scenarios, and to deliver periodic science assessments independent of the politics. And at that time, the politics were very vitriolic, with climate change advocates and deniers fighting out the battle largely in the US and Europe. IPCC operates on cycles and has established scenarios to help keep on track for Paris 1.5. And as an aside, I'll come back on this in later lectures. I'm involved at this very moment in creating a tourism version of the IPCC, one that brings climate scientists and tourism experts together to do exactly the same for tourism. I'll come back on that. Rio itself had 120 heads of state and was the defining moment in today's environmental activist initiatives. It built the link between economic, social, and environment futures. It gathered more than 30,000 people. It was my first international environment conference. It was a fascinating experience, particularly given the range of interests that had gathered in Rio, from indigenous people to religious groups, to local council NGOs, to the delegates themselves, and, as I said, 120 heads of state. That was the massive jump from the one head of state who had been in Stockholm 20 years earlier. It concluded that the concept of sustainable development was a fundamental core of human existence. It was an attainable goal for all the people of the world, regardless of whether they were operating locally, nationally, regionally, or globally. And that was one of the things that I took away from the Rio conference, that every local activity is unique. It's governed by the history, the culture, the psychology, the politics of the people in that locality. And every pathway to a sustainable future brings together these global principles that we're studying here with the local implementation. And that's a core message that I want to convey to you. One of the things that should be at the heart of all your thinking, the concept of local approaches. There are big global principles that we'll discuss during these lectures, but at the end of the day, when you go back home, you're applying those principles in a local context. And every one of you in this course has a me-shaped individual local context. And so the solutions will have to be solutions which work at the local level. The Rio Earth Summit produced a whole raft of new framework initiatives. Agenda 21, a 21st century agenda for planet and people and other species. And in your background papers, you'll find an Agenda 21 for travel and tourism. More on that later. It produced the Rio Declaration, again, another 27 principles for sustainable development, building on the principles that had been established 20 years earlier in Stockholm. It produced the UNFCCC. We think of this now as it is as an institution, but it stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a convention, an international treaty, which had to be taken back and ratified by national governments. And the treaty only came into effect in 1994 when it had achieved sufficient ratifications. And 1994 is the birth of the international climate movement. The Convention on Biodiversity was another output of Rio, dealing with all the issues related to the animal kingdom. Kyoto Protocol, this is a very, very important development. Why? Because it was the first agreement to limit greenhouse gas and to give birth to the concept of national commitments, i.e., it was the responsibility of individual nations to take control of their greenhouse gases and to report on this back to the central body, the UNFCCC Secretariat, annually. It was also the birth of the concept common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR. And this is the most important principle on which climate discussions take place. What does it mean, CBDR? It means we have a common challenge. We have a common responsibility to deal with climate change. But we have differentiated responsibilities as well, because some people are the biggest polluters. Some people have created 99% of the problem, and others, particularly the developing states, are the victims. They're the ones who have created and are creating the least greenhouse gases, but in many cases, excuse me, they're the ones who suffer the most. The small island states in the Pacific, the emerging states in Africa, the states of Latin America. All of these are areas who have not been creating greenhouse gases, but they're the ones who will suffer the most. And incidentally, many of them are also the tourism-centric states. They depend on tourism for their economic development. Moving on, 2000 saw the Millennium Development Goal. 8 goals focused on poverty reduction and strengthening the least developed countries. MDGs were focused on the developing states, and they had a timeline to 2015 to achieve their objectives. halving poverty, reducing childhood diseases, ensuring education for all. These kind of framework goals were pursued over the next 15 years. But almost immediately afterwards, there was another Earth Summit in 2002 with Rio Plus 10 in Johannesburg. This was again focused on poverty, but it had a greater engagement of civil society. It was more people-focused than planet, and not surprisingly because it was interlocked with the MDGs. And again, it was a summit that I was attending, this time as Assistant Secretary General of the UNWTO. The previous one I'd attended as the president of the WTTC, the first president of the WTTC. This one had a greater tourism engagement. In Rio, I was one of a handful, maybe half a dozen tourism people, most of them local from Brazil or from Latin America, attendees at the summit. There were no tourism issues under discussion in Rio. But by the time we came to Johannesburg, tourism had secured a small place inside the tent, so to speak. And indeed, the Secretary General of UNWTO was even given the opportunity as a head of a UN agency, because before 2000, UNWTO was just WTO. And it came into the UN system during the early part of this century. And that's when tourism began to get a position within the UN framework. Moving forward, we saw Rio Plus 20 in 2012. It recognized that the inclusive green economy is an important instrument towards achieving sustainable development. The idea of green growth was the dominant issue during that summit. It also produced hundreds of voluntary agreements to build sustainable development and green growth. This was the summit where stakeholders finally came into their own. And through the concept of voluntary agreements, it produced a raft of cooperation and collaboration between the public and the private sector, between the private sector itself, and even involving the NGOs. The Big Bang came in 2015 with both the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. The SDGs are 17 areas covering the future of everything, with 169 targets and 200 plus indicators. They build on the MDGs, but they go further. And they're covering advances not just in developing countries, but in the developed nations as well. The SDGs are a global, inclusive framework. The SDGs take over where the MDGs had finished. And the MDGs framework was 2015. This was the start of a new, broader framework. But at the same time, you had in Paris actually COP15, a massive climate agreement. And this was the first time in Paris when the world agreed on a target temperature increase goal of no more than 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees over the traditional pre-industrial temperatures. That is, the temperatures which prevailed basically before the 19th century. And that has become the holy grail of the climate movement. We have to restructure and reframe our global way of life so that our temperature does not increase more than what in 2015 was no more than 2 degrees, but what has increasingly become 1.5 degrees limit. At the same time, there was a landmark agreement on developing financing in Addis Ababa, which was going on at about the same time as the Paris Agreement. And there the government sought to provide some support for the transformation of the developing countries, the ones who had not created the problem but were the first victims. Moving along, we had the famous Glasgow COP26. We had COPs every year from Paris to Glasgow, but Glasgow, with all the razzmatazz and PR that the British government were able to bring to bear, and they're pretty good at that kind of stuff, produced the first tourism declaration organized by UNWTO and UNEP and a civil society group called Tourism Declares. And at COP27 in Sharm in Egypt, an even stronger or continuing build-up of tourism engagement. And I mentioned before, but I'll just say a little bit more now, the TPCC, which your two lecturers of this morning, Susan Beckham and Daniel Scott, and I are spearheading to create an IPCC science-based body for tourism. And it will be one of the first sectoral bodies of its kind, and it is being backed, supported by the Sustainable Tourism Global Council in Saudi Arabia, where I'm an envoy of that council. And this is a project that we set up in the council, but it's designed to be launched, funded for its first 3 years, and then it's on its own. It's set up deliberately as an independent body, and the people involved wanted this for it to be credible, and so did the STGC and the government of Saudi Arabia, who we discussed the creation of such a body in some detail with. So there you have it, 50 years of environmental and especially climate policy development. What have we learned? A few things. Climate is now globally recognized as existential. Adverse climate impacts are more and more evident. Third, there's been an accelerating worldwide engagement, driven very much by the commitment and the anger of young people that this challenge, which was established 50, 100 years ago, has not been adequately addressed. We've learned that adaptation, which is resilience, and mitigation, which is greenhouse gas reduction, these are the two UN buzzwords, adaptation for resilience and mitigation for reduction. They're in play everywhere. every government, every major industrial sector, including tourism, are focused on these two issues, albeit, in my view, too weakly at the moment. We've also learned that declarations are easy, but putting action into play is much harder to do. IPCC says we have to peak emissions in 2025. We have to halve them by 2030, and we have to achieve net zero by 2050. And we'll have a lot more to discuss about what net zero means in future lectures. Suffice it to say here that I'm in favor of absolute zero, real zero, not some nebulous form of offset supported continuing emission process. And how many self-declared authoritative studies will you find which ignore the 2025 target and make strong commitments for 2030 and 2050? I would say pretty much all of them. The industry is, however, committing to net zero 2050 and to halve it in 2030. And this is going to be a very important part of our future lectures. I want to thank you for your attention today, and I'm happy to answer any questions on today's lecture. As always, you'll find the lecture on the Thinkific platform, and you'll also find a significant amount of support material in the form of easy-to-watch videos and also base documents, which, if you have the time and the inclination, you will want to look at to get a more thorough vision of what is going on over this 50-year period. Thank you. To conclude today's lecture, I just want to show you how tourism has broadly fitted into this 50-year evolution. And I'm just going to skim through this now. The first real interest in the environment can be discerned in the tourism community in the 1970s and 1980s. And it was largely related to ecotourism and the impact of tourists on pristine environments. And then in the 1990s, following the Rio conference and all of that interest which was stimulated by it, some leading industry players and organizations began to engage. WTO, as it then was, it hadn't yet become a UN agency, was engaged from a policy perspective and was present in Rio. WTTC, after Rio, undertook an Agenda 21 for travel and tourism to try to bring key aspects of Rio into the tourism world. This was suggested by Maurice Strong when I asked him at Rio, what can we do as a sector in order to respond to the imperatives that Rio has been identifying? And indeed, we not only undertook an Agenda 21, but we offered that work and the research to the Earth Council, an institution that Maurice set up after Rio, and we'll talk about that, and to the UNWTO. And the three organizations, WTTC, the Earth Council, and WTO, traveled around the world promoting the conclusions in Agenda 21 for travel and tourism. And again, I would say, when you read this, you will see that there are some very specific recommendations in there. WTTC, we created a certification program, Green Globe. It was the first one, which was mirrored in the Caribbean, the Asia Pacific, and Australia. The major trade shows and sector media also jumped on the bandwagon. We created, I recall, with the World Travel Market in London, we created the first environmental awards with WTCC. And finally, in this context, a global certification program was established, the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, an independent organization, to bring structure and some form of overall regulation to what was becoming a haphazard certification system that some were saying was or could become greenwash. And then we got to the new millennium, and the focus on ecotourism was intensified with a major WTO conference in Quebec in 2003 or 4. And finally, climate was picked up and led by UNWTO. By that time, it had become a full UN agency, and major conferences were held in Gerba in 2003 and in Davos, which was really a huge conference with over 600 participants from around the world, which focused on the climate crisis. And this leadership of UNWTO has continued through increasingly close coordination with UNEP, the UN Environment Programme. Particularly, it has an industry group operating out of Paris, and they have worked very closely with UNWTO and now with the UNFCCC in Bonn, the climate agency. Similarly, WTTC is seeking a leadership role on the climate issue. And I would say a leadership role in an advocacy sense. It's positioning itself in the evolving COP framework. It's working in coordination with organizations like the World Economic Forum and other similar industry leadership organizations, and has recently produced with Accenture a major study on approaching net zero. And finally, in this context, the pivotal aviation and cruise sectors have been involved independently, and mainly because the UNFCCC agreement does not include aviation and it does not include maritime shipping, because both of those activities are regulated through different international UN conventions. One for shipping is the International Maritime Organization, and one for aviation, which has been incredibly active since 1944, the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal. A final point on this: it's almost by necessity that organizations which are multilateral and huge of that nature, and IATA and ICAO are both of those, multilateral and huge. It's difficult to distinguish lowest common denominator advocacy from collectively developed research. Action is often a challenge when you have to bring 200 airlines around a common position, particularly something which will mean they have to change their operating patterns and increase their costs, buying new aircraft, using sustainable aviation fuel, which is 3 to 5 times as expensive as traditional aviation fuel, then it becomes difficult to bring all of those players together. So on that, I want to thank you for staying the course on this first lecture. And with that, we're now going to have a discussion between us, a question and answers, if you like, to me. And I'll start off by opening the floor. If you want to speak, make a comment, or if you have a question or a viewpoint, raise your hand or state that you want to speak and your question, if you can, in the chat box, which is open for this. Over to you guys.